In the shadow of the well-known Crusades to the Holy Land, another crusade was unfolding far from the deserts of Jerusalem in the icy realms of Novgorod. Here, the German Teutonic Knights set their sights on a land guarded by warriors of a different creed. This is the story of a long-forgotten crusade of Germans to Russia, a story of a city of merchants that stood defiant against an onslaught, and of a battle that would determine the fate of Eastern Christianity. In the centuries that followed the First Crusades, the fervor for Christian expansion didn't wane. Instead, it found new directions. The Baltic region, a mosaic of rival tribes and ancient forests, stood as one of Europe's last bastions against Christianization. Following their initial failures to convert or subdue the local pagans through sporadic efforts, a large crusader army arrived at the Daugava River's mouth, establishing Riga in 1201 as their primary stronghold for subsequent conquests. The following year, 1202, saw the formation of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, who became the central military order in the Crusaders' wars against the pagan Baltic tribes. However, the campaign came at a great cost. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword, facing severe losses, were decisively defeated at the Battle of Saul. The survivors were subsequently merged with the Teutonic Knights in 1237, forming a new northern branch known as the Livonian Order. After decades of ruthless warfare, aided in part by the Danes, the Crusaders eventually carved out a territory known as Livonia, spanning the modern areas of Estonia and Latvia. Governing a restive land and engaged in near-constant warfare with the pagan Lithuanian tribes to the south, the Crusaders were hardly in an ideal position to open a new front. Yet the aftermath of the 1237 Mongol invasion of Russian lands presented an irresistible opportunity. While the Mongols devastated all the Russian principalities, Novgorod remained untouched, having swiftly acknowledged Mongol authority. This unique situation, coupled with Novgorod's historic reliance on now crippled Russian principalities for military support, seemed too opportune for the Crusaders to pass up. Despite the Russians' Christian faith, their adherence to Eastern Orthodoxy rendered them schismatics in the eyes of the Crusaders and thus legitimate targets for conquest. Albeit officially it was claimed that Russians were too lazy with Christianizing the pagan tribes under their control. Consequently, the stage was set for an ambitious campaign to conquer and Christianize the Republic of Novgorod, the wealthiest of the Russian principalities at the time. As the Teutonic Knights weighed their options for expansion, a new player entered the northern geopolitical theater, further complicating the situation. The nature of this intervention and whether it was orchestrated as a joint operation with the Livonian Crusaders remains somewhat ambiguous. However, in the summer of 1240, a Swedish force led by the Bishop of Finland navigated the Neva River. Their boats sliced through the waters, aiming to assert dominance over Lake Ladoga and, by extension, threaten the vital trade routes of Novgorod. Facing this incursion, Prince Alexander of Novgorod, a young but astutely strategic military leader, swiftly mustered his forces. In a decisive confrontation at the Battle of the Neva, Alexander's troops repelled the Swedish invaders, securing an end to their expedition and bolstering Novgorod's defense. His triumph by the river also earned him the enduring title Nevsky. Yet the reprieve brought by Alexander's victory was to be short-lived, and he himself was kicked out from Novgorod shortly after. A victorious leader and popular prince was bit too much for the merchant-oriented elite. Forced to leave the city he had defended so valiantly, Alexander retreated to Pereslavl, not alone, but taking some of Novgorod's best soldiers with him. This move not only robbed Novgorod of a formidable leader, but also sapped the city of its vital military strength at a time when threats loomed on all fronts. And this was just the beginning of Novgorod's troubles. In 1240, the Livonian Order launched a deep invasion into Novgorodian territory. They swiftly conquered the border fortress of Izborsk, took the city of Pskov, and even established a new stronghold in Koporye. Worse still, they installed garrisons in each of these places, signaling a clear intent not just to raid, but to establish a lasting presence. Faced with this unprecedented threat, Novgorod realized the gravity of their situation. It was in this moment of dire need that they called back their banished prince. Alexander, once expelled amidst political strife, was now summoned to lead Novgorod's defense against the increasingly overconfident Crusaders. In autumn 1241, Alexander Nevsky led his troops against the forts the invaders had erected east of Narva and drove them out. Then he moved southwards towards Pskov and took it, again without much difficulty. Surprisingly, the fortifications newly seized by the Livonian Order were not as well defended as one might expect. According to the Livonian Rime Chronicle, the garrison at Pskov, for example, was remarkably scant, comprising merely 2 knights of the order and their retinue, amounting to perhaps only 30 men in total. This lack of a strong military presence was partly due to the Crusaders' underestimation of Novgorod's capacity for a counterattack. Additionally, their forces were stretched remarkably thin, burdened with the dual tasks of subduing the restive local tribes and manning other border fortifications. With the conquest of Pskov, the pre-war borders were basically restored, but Alexander wasn't done. He then moved on to raid Livonian lands south of Dorpat, now known as Tartu. But while the Russians were busy looting, the Livonians scrambled an army. They ambushed and wiped out one of the Russian raiding parties. Catching wind of this, Alexander withdrew his forces and marched towards the Lake Peipus, with the Crusader army in pursuit. Alexander Nevsky led his army across the ice to the narrowest point dividing Lake Peipus's north and south. As they formed ranks on the opposite shore, the stage was set. It was April 5th, 1242, a day that would determine Novgorod's destiny. Alexander's army, with its strength of around 6,000, primarily consisted of the Novgorodian militia at the center, reinforced by the prince's personal retinue of elite cavalry and their most adept soldiers on the flanks. Additionally, they were supported by several hundred mercenary horse archers, also positioned strategically on the flanks. Confronting them across the icy landscape was the Crusader army, led by Bishop Hermann von Boxhovet of Dorpat, tallying at about 2,000. Commanding a mixed force that included about 1,000 Estonian auxiliaries, Danish knights, assorted Crusaders, and Teutonic knights, some formerly of the Livonian Sword Brothers, Bishop Hermann's contingent was notably formidable. Despite the hurried mobilization that might have compromised their numbers, the Crusaders' real edge lay in their heavy knights. Positioned at the heart of their formation, these knights were a battle-deciding force. Known for their devastating cavalry charges capable of turning the tide of battle within moments, their presence underscored the lethal potential of the Crusader army, with auxiliary troops bolstering the flanks and rears, ready to follow through on the momentum generated by the knights' charge. The battle erupted with the Crusaders' heavy cavalry launching their charge. In typical medieval fashion, the aim was to shatter the enemy's center through sheer momentum and the terror of the assault. The German knights plunged into the Russian ranks with devastating force, inflicting massive casualties. However, then something happened. The Russian center, despite the devastating impact, did not break. No one fled. Every soldier stood their ground, fighting to the death. Over the bodies of their fallen comrades, the survivors continued the fight, undeterred by the grim toll of their losses. Thus the knights, the Crusaders' formidable hammer, found themselves locked in hand-to-hand combat on the slippery ice, outnumbered by a tenacious and superior force. At this critical juncture, Alexander Nevsky entered the battle. Initially, he harried the enemy with volleys from his horse archers, softening the Crusader lines. Then, seizing the moment, he led a ferocious cavalry charge from the flanks, aiming to encircle and crush the core of the Crusader army, now deeply engaged on the icy field. Seeing this, the Estonian auxiliaries began to withdraw from the fray. Truth be told, of all the forces present, they had the least stake in the conflict's outcome. Subjugated by the Germans just 2 decades prior and now conscripted to fight alongside them, their allegiance was tenuous at best. With their flanks now exposed, this was the end for the Germans. Surrounded by all sides, it was their turn to fight until death, and many fell in the ensuing melee, including the Bishop Hermann. Yet amongst this total carnage, it seems that the knights maintained their discipline. A number of them managed to still cut through the enveloping Russian forces and fight their way back to safety. The toll of the battle was heavy, likely similar in casualties for both sides. However, the Russians, with their superior numbers, ultimately tipped the scales, overwhelming the Crusaders to secure victory. After the battle, it seems that both sides had enough. Nevsky did not pursue the Crusaders into Livonia, and the 2 sides signed an agreement in 1243 guaranteeing the old borders from before 1240. And with this battle, the Crusaders' designs on Russian lands were permanently shelved, and for the remainder of medieval times, there were no grand plans of conquests attempted by either side. And while the political border moved back and forth throughout the ages, the cultural border has remained where it was drawn in blood on that fateful spring day of 1242. To the west of Lake Peipus lies Europe. To its east stretch the vast territories of Russia.